What's going on, everyone? It is MC Politics and welcome back to a brand new video. Before we get started, make sure you like the video down below, subscribe to the channel if you're new or enjoyed today's content, hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss out on any future videos, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below the video. Make sure to follow all of my social links in the description down below. On my Rumble page, I'll be having exclusive content that will be posted in the future, and we'll talk about that when we get closer to doing so. And on my Instagram page is where I do most of my election content surrounding results, predictions, outcome. I also talk about corruptions, both parties, ideologies, political issues, and candidates running for office. So if you're interested in all that, make sure to follow my Instagram down below. TikTok will also be having election content going on there soon, and I will also be posting all of my videos on all platforms, aside from YouTube, on Rumble, Odysee, and Bitchute. So make sure you'll follow all that if you want to watch my videos on different platforms. So for today's prediction, we got a little bit of alternative history, and as you know, Joe Biden ended up dropping out of the presidential race around July 21st. This was around the time of the Butler, Pennsylvania incident that happened. It was before the Democratic National Convention took place around August, and the Republican Convention as well. And you had a lot of calls, especially around June, when they had an early presidential debate around that time, where Joe Biden underperformed a lot of people's expectations. The media was calling on him to drop out. Democrats are calling him to drop out. Candidates in office, representatives, senators, all of them were calling on Joe Biden to drop out so that they could nominate someone else. And they went with Kamala Harris, who ended up picking Tim Walz as their VP. But in this case, what if Joe Biden never dropped out and he stayed in the presidential race around this point in time and Kamala Harris still remained his vice president? Well, the first thing that would be different in this regards is that I really don't think this would go over well for the Democrats in this election, because I think that Joe Biden was more of a burden on the Democratic Party around this point in time than Kamala Harris was. Again, you were seeing polls where he had a collapse with minority voters. He wasn't polling that well, unlike Kamala Harris, on issues like immigration, the economy. Was like a double-digit win for Donald Trump. Foreign policy, Donald Trump was beating him at really well. Overall, the main issues in the polling was not going so good for Joe Biden. He also had a lot of issues surrounding his age at the time, considering that he was in his 80s at the time, and they were calling on him to take cognitive tests and competency tests, but he never really offered to really do so, and they didn't decline for him to do so, so that never took place as a result. So what would this map have looked like? We're going to go ahead and fill that out. I'm also going to throw in a bonus in this one, and I'm going to go ahead and fill out the 2024 Senate map of what it looked like if Joe Biden had stayed in the race as well. Because again, the president's ability to get the job done is going to depend on what happened in the United States Senate. Donald Trump won a 53-seat Senate majority in 2024 with Kamala Harris, but could he have won more? We'll take a look at that as soon as we get done filling the presidential map. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to fill out all the safe states for Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. So we're going to go ahead and fill out the West Coast here, Hawaii, and we're going to go ahead and fill out all of these states here except New Hampshire and New Jersey. We're not going to fill out just yet. I think Connecticut, Delaware, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, it would all stay safe. Maine's 1st District would be safe in this regard. Colorado, we'll talk about that in a minute. I think that is about it from what I can see. All right, we're going to go ahead and now fill out the Republican seats for Donald Trump. They're safe. So the Mormon belt right here will all go to Donald Trump. The Dakotas. Texas would definitely be like a 15-point win for Donald Trump. I think that Joe Biden would collapse even further in the Rio Grande Valley. He wouldn't do well in the suburbs and cities. A lot of voters wouldn't turn out in this election scenario. I think overall Donald Trump would sweep the floor with them in that election. Louisiana, basically all of the South would go to Donald Trump. Iowa, Ohio would even be safe as well. Donald Trump would win it by 11 points. I think he would win it by around 13 or 14 against Joe Biden in this case. South Carolina, Florida would be almost a 15-point win for Donald Trump. Alaska would be close to approaching the 20-point win, but I still think that it would be safe for Donald Trump. And he'll also win everything in Nebraska except the 2nd district we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Maine's 2nd district, I think, would be safe in this regard as well. And it is all of these safe seats for Donald Trump that I want to fill out. So we got 219 safe electoral votes for Donald Trump, 120 for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We're going to go ahead and move into some likely states in this scenario. We'll start off with Joe Biden. Illinois would be in the likely column. New York would be in this column. New Jersey, no. Colorado would be likely in this case. And I believe that's about... And Maine at large, I still think it probably would have been likely in this case for Joe Biden. Maybe lean if he didn't do that well with the Democratic base in the state like Maine. But I think he would relatively win it pretty likely in this case. For Illinois, I definitely do think that voters in Chicago... I think Donald Trump would do better around these Chicago and its suburbs. He definitely would get close to maxing out in the rural areas. Not fully, but he would do better in a lot of these rural areas. He'd do better in maybe like the Springfield area as well. Just some of these working class Democratic legacy areas he definitely would do better in overall. I think this would probably be around a 7 to 9 point win for Joe Biden in this regard. Kamala Harris won it by 11 points in 2024 for comparison. New York, in comparison, Kamala Harris won the state of New York by 12 points. I think Joe Biden, considering the polling throughout the state in the 2024 election, it definitely would have been under 10 points in this regard. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the state of New York here. I think definitely Queens, Trump would have come close to cracking 40s there. Definitely could have maybe gotten 30s in like the Bronx and Bronx and Brooklyn area, my bad. Manhattan, he probably could have gotten 20%, maybe. But definitely Queens, he would have cracked 40 there. Definitely could have seen him get upper 50s as Suffolk. Maybe could have flipped Broome County in this regard. Could have flipped, like, Essex County. This county probably would have flipped. Saratoga would have flipped. Rockland, that probably would have been almost close to his... it's still upper 50s, maybe a couple points better. I don't think he would do that much better against Joe Biden there. Definitely a lot of these red areas would get a lot more redder in like the 60s to 70s. And overall, I think he would do okay in upstate New York. Probably would get closer in a place like Erie County, maybe to flipping. He definitely would get it within 5 in this regard. Staten Island definitely would get upper 60s, not 70s. It would get close, but I still think it'd be upper 60s. So with that being said, New York would be a likely margin, maybe by around like a 6 to 8 point win for Joe Biden. So around the Kathy Hochul margin, which is probably why I'd see with someone like Joe Biden. Maine at large, the Democratic voting coalition in the state is filled with both non-college and college-educated base. Both of them have voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. There's a lot of Irish voters, Irish immigrants in a place like Maine that tend to vote a lot more Democratic for a relatively working-class state compared to places like the Rust Belt. So in this regard, I think it probably would be like a 5 to 6 point win for Joe Biden, but it would still be in the likely column for him. Now for Donald Trump's likely states, we got Arizona, Nevada. I don't think it would be likely. I think it would be close. I think North Carolina probably would have been likely in this regard, so we'll put both of those in the likely column. We'll start off with North Carolina, which North Carolina, on the presidential level, Donald Trump won it by around 3 points. I could see this being around a 5 point win for him. Again, he'd do well in this like northeastern portion with minority rule voters. Definitely would get under upper 70s, so under 80 in like Durham County. Wake County probably could do like a point better and get him like around 60% or so. Definitely could do better around this little panhandle area. Definitely could do well around here in this little southern portion. You probably could have seen New Hanover flip a Republican in this regard. Probably could have seen Wilson flip Republican. don't think Watauga County, I don't know how to pronounce that. I think that could have gotten a little bit closer. Um, I don't think it would flip any of these counties. Pitt could probably have a chance of flipping in this regards. Definitely a more exurban, suburban county. Some of these suburbs are more like Republican heavy, so I definitely do think he would gain a little bit in the suburbs here. Overall, I think it would be a 5-point win for him. And then Arizona, this is the big one for him because I only had him winning like by around like 2 to 4 points against Joe Biden in the summer of 2024. I think he could have done better in this regard. When you take a look at it, Yuma definitely would have gotten above 60. Definitely could have made a case for Gila and Greenlee getting above 70. Santa Cruz would have gotten a little bit more closer. Maricopa definitely would have been won by like 3 to 5 points with Donald Trump. Mojave could have approached 80 maybe. Pinal definitely would have been a little more higher. Trying to think. Basically, a lot of Latino heavy areas, as well as some of like the Christian areas, would definitely he would do better with them. So Christians and Latinos definitely would do better throughout the state of Arizona, which would give him around a 5 to 6 point win in that regards for him. Moving into some lean states for Joe Biden, we'll start off with the state of New Mexico. I think would have been lean in this case. New Jersey, I think. Ooh, I think it probably would have been lean in this case still. I think it would have been around like maybe a 2 to 3 point win in this regards. I know there were some polls that had Donald Trump winning the state of New Jersey, but I think when all the votes were counted and turnout was taken into consideration, I think that Joe Biden would collapse more in the southern portion of New Jersey. He definitely would still lose counties like Atlantic and Cumberland. Passaic would get a little bit more redder. Definitely could have had a chance to flip Bergen. Could have gotten maybe Essex closer to under 70, maybe. Union would have been under 50. Maybe Middlesex and Burlington and Somerset would have gotten closer. Some of these you could have cracked 60s in. Maybe you could have had a chance to approach 70s. I still think he would have won Ocean County by the 60s, though. There's only so much votes you could get in red counties, even though it is a pretty big red county for a state like New Jersey, because New Jersey doesn't really have a lot of rural areas throughout the state, but some of them do have a lot of working class areas throughout the state, especially in the southern portion. There's also like Asians, Italian voters, Latinos, a lot of minority groups that trended toward Donald Trump's direction, and I think they would have trended to him a lot more than they did in 2024 in this regards because of Joe Biden being on the ticket. Again, lower voter turnout among minority voters in this regards would have boosted Donald Trump definitely if he didn't pick up more voters in this case. So definitely could see only a 2 to 3 point win for Joe Biden in a state like New Jersey. And now for New Mexico, this one is mainly just because of Hispanics. I don't think Donald Trump would make that much inroads with like the college educated voters like the North, but definitely you could have made a case he could have done better in like the southern portion of New Mexico. Cibola probably would have flipped, and Guadalupe probably would have flipped Republican in this regard. Um, Grant could have gotten a little bit more closer, but I don't think it would have flipped. More just northern person was Democratic at the time. I definitely do think it would just do better in the southern portion. The southern portion is where a lot of like oil and gas industries are. So these are the voters that Donald Trump would really, really, really do well with in a state like New Mexico, and he would get it around a 3 to 4 point loss for him in a state like New Mexico as a result. Nebraska second, I'm also going to put in the lean column. This isn't really an area that Donald Trump does well in. It is mostly made up of Omaha, which is a very Democratic city. I think Donald Trump would approve slightly from there, especially in like the redder portion of Ottawa County, which we could go ahead and take a look at this on the House level as well. Actually, I'm going to go to the state because that will give us better results. There we go. We'll take a look at the second district here. Donald Trump definitely would have done a little bit better in Sarpy. Saunders, I think, is pretty much maxed out. Douglas maybe could have gained some votes with some minority groups there. Overall, I think it still would have been around the lean D margin. He wouldn't flip it. I think he would have flipped it if it was maybe someone who didn't do well with like establishment and city voters. He could have flipped in that regards, but not in this case. So we're gonna go ahead and keep that one in the likely Democratic column. Now we're going to go ahead and move into some lean Republican states for Donald Trump. We're going to go ahead and fill out the state of Pennsylvania in this column. The state of Georgia will also go into the lean column for him. Nevada will also go in the lean column for him as well. Now, taking a look at, we'll talk about Pennsylvania afterwards. I want to focus mostly on Nevada and Georgia. Oh, Virginia, I did forget that one. And Minnesota, we'll talk about those in a minute. I'll fill those on in a minute as soon as I'm done talking about them. Nevada, we're going to go ahead and look over to because this was a potential swing state, which turned out to go more in favor of Donald Trump in this regard. He ended up winning by around almost close to 3.5%. I think he could have approached 5% in this regard, but I think Clark County, he still would have lost, but very narrowly. Washoe could have had a chance to flip if turnout was lower on the Democratic side, but definitely he would have done better around these rural areas. The no tax on tip, overtime, and Social Security issue definitely would have played out well in a state like Nevada for Donald Trump. There was also a lot of Latino voters that were moving into the state that were moving towards the Republican column. A lot of California, Oregon, and Washington liberals, or conservatives in that regard. The liberals are moving more towards Colorado. I got that confused. The conservatives, on the other hand, are moving more into a place like Nevada and some of these rural areas, moving into a place like Clark County as well. The population is growing more Republican there. So Donald Trump, he would have gotten close to flipping Clark County, but would have been under it. I think it would have been about a 4 to 5 point win for him in that regard. So I'm going to keep Nevada in the lean column for him. Georgia, I think that Joe Biden would have collapsed in the Atlanta areas, actually. In Fulton County, I definitely think he would have done a little bit worse in that county. DeKalb as well. Rockdale and Clayton maybe could have done a little bit worse there. I think Joe Biden would have still continued trends in places like Douglas, Henry, Newton, but Gwinnett ended up moving a little bit right, and Cobb, I think, moved a little bit right as well. Oh, Cobb only moved a little bit left, but I think Cobb County would have moved right in this case. Gwinnett would have moved right. DeKalb. Some of these more like city areas, I definitely do think Trump would have done better with black voters in that area. But definitely the black voters, he would have done better in places like Savannah and around the southwestern rural portion of the state. Again, South Georgia, he would have done better with these voters down here, would have gotten more Republican, maxed out some of the rural counties down here. The northern portion was mostly close to maxed out, so I don't think he would have gained too much here. Overall, I think this would have been enough to boost him to about a 3 to 4 point win because it is a changing state, but I don't think Joe Biden was a better fit for the state around this point in time for his reelection bid. So we're going to put that one in the lean column. Pennsylvania, Democrats had a 200,000 voter registration heading into their election in the 2024 election in Pennsylvania. Democrats held around a 500,000 vote advantage in the 2020, and they held around a 900,000 vote advantage in 2016, and then they held a million voter registration in 2008 and 2012. Now, the thing about Pennsylvania, when you take a look at it, is that it's not only legacy Democrats that Democrats have to worry about in the state, but also a lot of young voters are turning out to vote. Amish voters are definitely a big one in presidential elections. Donald Trump did very well with Amish voters. Latino voters especially make up some of these northeastern portions. Bucks County, more of like a working class suburb. Lackawanna County definitely has some working class areas and a big steel community there. Monroe, Northampton, definitely a lot of workers in that area. Pennsylvania has a lot of coal workers, especially in some of these rural portions. A lot of legacy Democrats in more the western Pennsylvania portion. Butler County, I still think would have moved right, which, funny enough, that was the place where the incident happened. I don't want to talk too much about that. Beaver could have reached 60s in this regard. Maybe could have got 70s in Warren and Crawford. Definitely would have maxed out Western Pennsylvania in this regard. The T region would have done well in. Center County, this is more of a college county, but I do think Donald Trump would have had a chance to get it like under 50% possibly, depending on the third party vote in this regard. Third party is definitely a consideration that Joe Biden would have had to worry about in this election. Lehigh definitely would have flipped, I think, in this case. Monroe still would have flipped red. Trump probably would have done better in Bucks. Philadelphia definitely would have maybe done a point better there. Chester County, I don't think he would have done that much better there just because it is a more establishment or college heavy county. Montgomery and Delaware would have still remained relatively similar. Overall, I think that Donald Trump would have reached about a 2-point victory in a state like Pennsylvania, so we're going to go ahead and put that one in the lean column for him. Going back to Joe Biden, we're going to go ahead and put the state of Virginia in the lean column, as well as, I don't know about Minnesota, honestly. Virginia, I think it could have gotten a little bit closer. This probably would have been only about a 1 to 2 point victory for Joe Biden. But I think Minnesota, it would have had a different result, as well as New Hampshire, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But Virginia, in this case, it is more of like an establishmentarian state in this regards. I still think Nova probably would have collapsed a little bit. Loudoun County, he probably would have done a little bit worse in. Some of these Prince William and Fairfax areas, Joe Biden would have done worse in. Trump probably could have maybe flipped Virginia Beach if he was having a good night here. Definitely could have flipped like Sussex in the Republican column. Stafford definitely would have flipped Republican. Montgomery could have gotten close to that. Radford, he probably could have flipped, even though it is a very small county. I was trying to zoom in on that. I can't really zoom in on these small counties, my bad. Overall, I think he would have maxed out the rural areas in this regard, or close to it. Definitely would have done way better there. Would have done better in the southern portion in some of these red counties here. Overall, it would have led to about a 2 to 3 point victory. Considering a lot of polls had this relatively close in the 2024 election with Joe Biden in this scenario, I don't think he would have done well with the voter base there in the state. So I do think it would have been around a lean to maybe a tilt Democratic victory. I'll probably put it just lean, I think, in this regard. And then we're going to go ahead and move into some other states. The state of Michigan, I think Donald Trump probably would have won this relatively easily. Now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more. In a state like Michigan, this is a big one because this is a state that I think could get more Republican than Wisconsin, believe it or not, especially when you consider Trump almost flipped Genesee County in this regard. He lost it by around upper single digits in both 2016 and 2020, but still managed to pick off Michigan with that vote. I think that Genesee County is going to flip at some point in time, especially with a heavy legacy Democrat and working class coalition in that state. Kent County would have gotten a little bit closer, but would have stayed blue. Ottawa probably could have been 60%. Maybe you could have cracked. Could have done a little bit better in Traverse, but I think Joe Biden had a decent appeal with old voters, so I don't think it would have been that much. Wayne and Washtenaw, definitely you could have made a case Washtenaw could have been under 60. Wayne County still would have remained around 60s there. Donald Trump would have done better with the Arab voters in this community. The Thumb, he probably would have gotten a lot more Republican. Macomb definitely could have gotten closer to 60s, but not quite to 60, if that makes sense. Marquette, he could have done a lot better. There were some of the minor voters. The farmers will do better in the rural areas, obviously. He'll do better with a lot of car industry workers. Overall, I think that Michigan would go to Donald Trump by around... I'm going to say like 1.5 to 2 points. I'm going to keep that one maybe lean to tilt. I'm going to keep it lean in this case. I think it would be around a 2-point win. Pennsylvania, maybe 2 to 3 points. So I'm going to keep it around a lean column in this case. Wisconsin. I'm going to keep this one still in the tilt column. I think it would have been I think it would have been around a 1 point victory, so similar to a Ron Johnson margin in the state of Wisconsin when you're taking a look at it. The Wows probably would have relatively stayed similar. The Bows maybe could have done better in Green Bay. Door County probably could have flipped Portage. Could have flipped like Green County. I don't think any of these would flip. Those would be the only two he really would have flipped. Maybe Dory could have gotten it closer, but I don't think it would have flipped because, again, of retirees from Chicago moving into there. Definitely could have done better in like Racine and Kenosha. Milwaukee definitely would have gotten the mid-60s. Madison, this is a big one. I don't think it would have turned out as much for Joe Biden. I think it would have remained around lower 70s in this regard, which would probably push it to a 1.1.5 point victory in a state like Wisconsin. Rules probably would have gotten maybe a little bit better, but not as much. I think Donald Trump would have won it by around 1 to 1.5 points when the votes are all counted. Now, Minnesota, I'm debating this one honestly because I believe that this is a state that Donald Trump could have flipped in this regard. I think that Joe Biden probably would have just narrowly had won it in 2024. Whereas I think that Donald Trump would have ultimately have flipped New Hampshire in this case very narrowly, which would have boosted his margin to 316 electoral votes. New Hampshire, more of a libertarian state, typically swings against the incumbent president, so Joe Biden would have done way worse there because of the national environment getting a little bit more redder. In this case, Republicans definitely would have dominated the economic issues in a place like New Hampshire, whereas I don't think social issues would be very impactful in this kind of election, especially with Biden's unpopularity in this regard. So I think overall, New Hampshire probably would have flipped to Donald Trump when the votes are counted. You know what? I'm gonna say that Wisconsin is lean, but I think that Minnesota probably would flip. Here's what I'm thinking about this one, and we'll go ahead and take a look at it here. Hillary Clinton only won this state by around 2 points with the fact that she wasn't able to turn out the Democratic voter base. She won by around 1 to 2 points. You look at places like the Twin Cities, these definitely could have gotten under 60s. You definitely wouldn't have seen a turnout factor in this regard. I think Arabic voters would have either voted third party or voted more for Donald Trump in this case. I think you would have done better in like the suburbs here. Probably could have flipped like a county like Lake. Could have done better in Carlton. Could have flipped Clay County. Definitely these would have gotten a little bit more redder. The rules would have gotten a little bit more redder in this regard. I don't think you would have flipped Duluth or any of these other ones, but Lake you probably would have a chance of flipping. Maybe doing better in like Anoka, Carver, Scott just by a little bit. Overall, I think the main impact on this one is going to be the cities. And I don't think that they would turn out heavily for Joe Biden. Thinking a little bit more on it, I don't think Madison would turn out to the highest degree as well. So probably around a 1.5 to 2 point victory in Wisconsin. And then Donald Trump would have narrowly flipped the state of Minnesota in this regard, which would have given Donald Trump a 326 electoral vote victory to Joe Biden's 212 electoral vote victory. Definitely Joe Biden's electability factor would have been mainly because of the cities and not getting out a lot of college educated voters. He would have done way worse with minority voters in this regard. He still held up relatively decent numbers of working class voters, but I think the turnout factor with this base would have been the ending result for him in this election. Now moving over into the Senate race, and we're going to go by this really quickly here. Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, Nebraska, Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, Indiana, West Virginia, which would have been a flip for Republicans. All those will be in the safe column. And I think Ted Cruz probably would have won safe in this regard too, given the fact that he only he only lost by around 8 to 9 points against Colin Allred. I think Joe Biden would have carried Allred down a little bit in a state like Texas, so probably could have been a little bit like safe to likely. Gotta keep it safe in this regard. Montana is. We'll talk about that one in a minute, but the Democratic states, California, Washington, Hawaii. Still think Klobuchar would have won safe in this regard. I think she still would have won by double digits because of her challenger being Royce White, who was more along the lines of like the far right, but still did better in like a lot of rural areas compared to Amy Klobuchar's past result. I think she still would have did relatively well though in a state like Minnesota. Still would have won by like double digits or so, so that would have been safe. No, not Maryland. Delaware. We'll talk about New Jersey in a minute. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont would have been all safe. I think New York still would have been double digits in this case for Kirsten Gillibrand. And that is all of these states that I really see that I want to put in that column. Okay, moving into some likely states for Republicans. Montana, I still think would have been likely, but it would have been around an 8 to 9 point victory because I don't think the tester would have been able to overcome the presidential environment against someone like Tim Sheehy with Donald Trump on the ballot. I feel like if it maybe would have been like Matt Rosendale as the nominee, he probably would have been able to do a little bit better in this state. But overall, the trends and the national environment was going to catch up to Tester at some point. Osborne would still do well against Fisher because she's not exactly a good candidate. She's very establishmentarian. Not exactly well liked by a lot of Nebraska voters. Way worse on approval ratings than someone like Pete Ricketts is. I think she would have lost to Dan Osborne by around 8 to 10 points, maybe just because of the Joe Biden factor, but still would have been likely. Ohio, I'm not going to put that one there. Now for likely states, we're going to put New Mexico, New Jersey, Maryland, Maine, and Virginia all in the Democratic column. Now, New Mexico, Nella Dominici, I believe, was the candidate for this race. She lost by exactly 10 points. I think she would have gotten under 10 in this case, just because of Joe Biden being on the ballot. I think she would have done a little bit better in some of these rural areas and like the southern portion to be able to win the state. Or not win the state, but get it under 10. But she would be far from winning the state against an incumbent like Martin Heinrich. So in that case, I'm definitely going to put it in the likely column. Maryland, I think Larry Hogan would have gotten under 10 in this case, but I still think the presidential effects would have been a lot for him to overcome in like what was like a Harris plus 30 state in 2024. Yeah, it would have been harder for him to overcome. Andy Kim was relatively a strong candidate in New Jersey. If this was Bob Menendez, I definitely do think that Republicans would have flipped it, but I think Andy Kim still would have lost by around 6 to 8 points just because he has better appeals in the state than someone like Joe Biden did. Definitely would have minimized losses in the Senate race, unlike someone like Bob Menendez, who ended up going to jail, by the way. You can look into that a little bit more. Virginia, or actually he faced 10 to 15 years of prison, now that I'm thinking about, not jail time, but prison time. Look into that if you want to on Twitter. There's some info about that from Calvin Coolidge Project if you want to go take a look on that. Virginia, I think Hung Cal probably would have lost, is still relatively about the same as the 2024 result with Harris on the ballot. I think that Tim Kaine just overall has better appeals to like Nova, the Virginia Beach area, the suburbs. It just would have been too much for someone like Hung Cal to be able to overcome. Even though Hung Cal, he's relatively good candidate for a state like Virginia, I just don't think he would have made that much of improvements. Angus Keene, there is a ranked choice voting ballot in the state. I don't think maybe he would have won the first ballot in this case, but definitely he would have won in this case by around a likely margin when all the votes are casted. So that is all the likely states for Republicans, and Democrats, and we're going to move into some leaning Republican states. So we're going to go ahead and put Ohio into this column, which is the only one I'm going to put in this column for the time being. Now, for Ohio, this was an interesting one because you had Bernie Moreno, who was a used car salesman. He underperformed Trump big time. He only won by around like three to 4 points in a state like Ohio, whereas Donald Trump won it by 11 points against Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown, I had losing almost the entire time during the 2024 election, even with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. I never had Sherrod Brown winning because the environment would have been too much for him to overcome. Many people said otherwise, and I proved to be vindicated on that. And even Mahoning County, which I had going blue in my final prediction, didn't even go to Sherrod Brown. I don't even think he would have won it, even with Joe Biden. Delaware, maybe he could have flipped, but I don't think he would have. That still would have stayed Republican. Overall, I think a lot like this Cole part would have moved a little bit more Republican. Still would have been a relatively same result, maybe by around maybe a 4 to 5 point win for Moreno, just because of the down ballot effects in this case. But overall, it still would have been a major underperformance from Donald Trump. And even J.D. Vance's 6 to 7 point margin against Tim Ryan, this would have been a big underperformance there. So Bernie Moreno, he still would have won and flipped the Senate race in Ohio. So that would have been around a lean margin still. Now moving into some Democratic states. Actually, the only state I think that Democrats would hold on to in this case would be Arizona, just because of the Kerry Lake factor. In this case, I still think it would have been under 1 point, though. It would have been an overwhelming margin for Ruben Gallego in this case. I don't think that Kerry Lake has that much great appeals to Hispanics. She ended up losing by around like 2 to 3 points when Donald Trump won the state by around 3 points. I think if Donald Trump even won it by Donald Trump would almost have to win it by around like close to double digits for Kerry Lake to even win. Which would, to think about that you need that much to have down ballot effects for Kerry Lake to go over finish line. Yeah, she was not a good candidate for a state like Arizona. I still think that Ruben Gallego would have pulled it off in this case. However, here's where things get a little bit different. I still think McCormick would have won. I'm leaning on like around tilt to lean Republican in this case. I'm going to put it still in the tilt column just because Bob Casey did have some appeals to like the northeastern portion, which allowed it to stay competitive. But here's where things get a little bit different. I think that Slotkin would have fell in this case. Looking a little bit back on this race, she only won this race by 30,000 votes, which is like around like 30 to 40,000 votes. So she only won by like 0.3%, which I thought she would win by like around 1 to 2 points because of Democrats doing better down ballot and doing better aside from when Democrats run against Trump in the state. I thought she would do a lot better. She only won Saginaw County by around like a couple votes. Not even that much. At one point she was only winning it by 3 votes. Yeah, I think this would have flipped to Mike Rogers in this case, definitely. Muskegon would have got more Republican. Definitely Ottawa would have been over 60. Kent County would have had a chance to possibly flip. In this case, maybe. I don't think it would have, but definitely would have gotten closer. Grand Traverse would have been a little more Republican. Eaton would have been more Republican. Washtenaw would have been under 60 in this case. Wayne County still would have been relatively the same. Maybe Rogers would do better in a place like Oakland. Macomb would do a little bit better in. Overall, I think that Mike Rogers had the recipe to win the state of Michigan for the Senate race in the 2024 election. And now for a state like Wisconsin, I think Eric Hovde would have won in this case too. Looking a little bit back on it, the only reason he lost is because of Milwaukee. That is the only reason he lost. Because when you take a look at Tammy Baldwin, she won this by around like 69% and only won by like a couple tens of thousands of votes. When you take a look at it at the presidential level, what did Donald Trump lose this by? So 68%. Let's take a look at it at the Senate level. So 69. So yeah, I think Milwaukee and Madison were like the main areas that really kept Tammy Baldwin above water in this case. But I think that Eric Holvday, depending on how much Donald Trump won Wisconsin by, I feel like it was around 1-2. I think that Eric Holvday would have had a shot to have flipped the seat. So I think in this case, he probably would have done a little bit better than Donald Trump, and wow, definitely would have gotten above 60, a little bit of Waukesha. Similar in Washington, Ozaukee would have been the same. Some of these counties would have been the same. Definitely would have maybe a flip Sauk County possibly. Would have done a little bit better in like the Kenosha area. Maybe the rules he would have done a little bit better in. Overall, I think Tammy Baldwin would have been doomed with Joe Biden on the ballot. And then Nevada, surprisingly, it was closer than I originally thought. I thought that Jackie Rosen would have been able to win this by around maybe a lean to likely D margin, just because Sam Brown really isn't the best candidate for a state like Nevada. But Jackie Rosen ended up pulling this off shockingly for Democrats. Even though this is a state that's trending Republican, Democrats tend to do better in these down ballot races and like midterm elections in a place like Nevada. Clark County should do a little bit worse in, but Sam Brown didn't really do that well in a place like Clark County. I still think it would have gotten maybe like a point or two Republican. In this case, Washoe probably would have been a little bit more Republican, but still would have stayed blue. Yeah, I think that the third party vote maybe could have been damaging for like Jackie Rosen almost, but I think that Sam Brown could have had the recipe to have pulled it off narrowly in this regard. And with that being said, that is my final predictions. Donald Trump would have won the 2024 presidential election by 326 electoral votes, and he would have carried a Republican Senate of about 55 to a 56 seat majority for Republicans in this case. So that is my final prediction of what would have happened in the 2024 election. And with that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Like the video down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're new or enjoyed today's content. Hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss on any future content. Questions, comments, thoughts, or concerns, go in the comment section below the video. Follow all my social links in the description down below. And share this with your family and friends if you enjoyed today's video. And with that being said, guys, thanks for watching. Take care, everyone, and have a great day.